please. Okay, everybody, welcome. You'll have your chance. Welcome to the annual Sidney and Walter Siben Distinguished Professorship Lecture in Family Law. This professorship was established in 1984 and is supported by a gift from the law firm of Siben and Siben. And I didn't see any of the Sibens here, but if you're here, I didn't see you. Raise your hand if you're not. Okay. The purpose of the professorship is to promote scholarly research, conferences, publications in the field of family law, and it certainly has. We continue to thank Siben and Siben for the wonderful gift which year after year has brought thoughtful and provocative and cutting-edge scholarship to this law school. In this year's presentation by Professor Nancy Dowd, from what I can tell by reading some of her work last night, will be no different. It will be really provocative. Before I turn to my job as the introducer of the Sidney and Walter Siben Distinguished Professor Joanna Grossman, I do want to take a moment to introduce her predecessor, John Gregory, who is so modern that he is locked in his little smartphone screen. John, as many of you know, but some of you don't, was for many years the Siben professor and the impresario of this annual lecture. And it was actually John's determination year after year to bring speakers like Professor Dowd to the law school, which has set the tone of excellence for all of the talks we have had since. The current holder of the chair, as I said earlier, is Professor Joyner Grossman. She has been both a profound and prolific contributor to the family law literature. Her work has appeared in a broad array of law journals, including Stanford, Georgetown, Yale, and more. In the past year alone, she's published many articles, in past 2 years, many articles and several books, including a book on New York family law with our colleague, Professor Barbara Stark. Her terrific book, co-authored with the superb legal historian Lawrence Friedman, called Inside the Castle Law in the Family in the 20th Century, has expanded her teaching and reputation well beyond the law school world, as have her many columns in Justia Verdict. The last chapter of Professor Grossman's Inside the Castle is basically a caution about predicting the future of family law. There is no ending, she says. The book comes to an end, but the story does not. The story of life goes on into the void, so too the story of law. Those were her last words there. And that ending, I hope, will be the purpose of the Siben lectures each year and over the years to fill in that void, to continue to tell the story. I also don't want to let this moment pass without thanking Professor Grossman for the abundance of contributions she has made to this law school over the last many years. So with that, I introduce you to the Sidney and Walter Siben Distinguished Professor of Law, Joyner Grossman.
Thank you, Dean Lane, and welcome everyone to this year's Siben lecture, which will be given today by Professor Nancy Dowd. Here. She is the David H. Levin Chair in Family Law at the University of Florida Levin College of Law, and I could just tell you that if she's the Levin Chair at the Levin College of Law, that means she's the most important person there. Just like if I'm the Siben professor and this is the Siben and Siben Moot courtroom, then it's mine. So I will determine what happens in this room. So I also was going to say a word of welcome to John Gregory, who has been a friend and mentor and colleague for many years, and who really built this lecture series into something that the school can be very proud of, and that is known. People know, like, oh, I was a Siben lecturer once, I was a Siben lecturer, and that's really all thanks to John's work. All I've done is continue it. And I can only assume he's wearing all red because he thinks it's still equal pay day when you wear red to document the blood out of women's paychecks, which was on Tuesday though. I am wearing black because I'm back to my non-equal pay day outfit. But my introduction is about Professor Dowd, who I'm just so very happy to have here. She is a cutting-edge scholar in every way you might use that term. Her work cuts across many areas, a lot of which overlap with my own areas, so I'm especially appreciative of the work she does. She works in family law, gender law, some con law thrown in, and she approaches family law from a social justice perspective. She's an expert in juvenile law and one of the foremothers of masculinities theory. I just like that phrase, but it's true that masculinity theory was really founded mostly by women. And Nancy has been an important person who has reminded us that although feminist theory always says, ask the woman question, right? How do these things affect women? She's the one who says, well, you have to ask the man question to ask the woman question. You have to understand both. Gender works both ways, and you really can't understand one without the other. So she is the editor of a book in 2010 that's really a foundational text in this emerging field of masculinities theory, where she looks at complicated interrelationships between masculinity, race, gender, and class. She's also a co-author of a feminist reader, which is absolutely a staple in the field and we couldn't do without. But her most recent books focus on the topic she's going to talk about today, or it's related to a topic. She has a book, Justice for Kids, and a book called A New Juvenile Justice System, that were published as part of an NYU book series that she edits on families, law, and society, which really has become the most interesting collection of family law books that have been written in the last several years. So I personally, when I go to conferences, I don't like to buy a lot of books because then I have to carry them. But I always go to the NYU table and say, what's new in this series? Because I know it's going to be the most interesting stuff that has come out in the last year. So her current work focuses on the need for juvenile justice reform, and her talk today, which you have the title here, Black Boys Matter, using the life course of black boys to develop a model of equality for all, grows out of that work. Her articles number too many to count, her books even maybe too many to count. She's also the emeritus director of the University of Florida's Center for Children and Families. She's been a very important institution. I have always admired her work, and part of the fun of being the Siben professor is I get to pick somebody every year who I would like to spend more time with and hear from, and that is absolutely how I make the decision. And so I'm very happy that she was willing to come here and take time out of her schedule to be with us. I have students here in my social change class who have taken turns introducing speakers, and I always say, don't just read their bio, tell me something interesting that I wouldn't know about them by looking on the internet. So I will follow my own advice, and I have been told on good authority that last summer, while some of us were tinkering with symposium articles that no one will ever read, Nancy was buying a boat in Annapolis and sailing herself to Maine with just a couple of friends, no captain, nobody else running the ship. It wasn't a yacht cruise, just Nancy and her boat. And she's an avid sailor and told me last night her soul is in the ocean. So thank you so much for being here, and we all look forward to your lecture.
Wow. I hope I can live up to the introduction. Yes, I was the captain of the ship last summer. I guess I'm the captain of things today. Thank you for the wonderful, warm welcome, and I appreciate so much that all of you are taking your time out to be here, and I hope I can convince you that this is time well spent. Now, make sure I can hold my I feel like I have 6 guns here, talking and the PowerPoint. So, I want you to imagine that you are in the maternity ward of a hospital, and you're gazing through the windows at the babies who were born today. This is their very first day. And suddenly you notice that somebody is walking in and marking the cribs, and you're wondering what's going on. And when you ask, you are told, well, some of the babies are being slated for nurture and support until they become adults, so they can reach their full developmental potential, and some are not. And not only are the ones who are not going to lack that support, they're going to have some obstacles put in their path. And while some of them have those obstacles and lack of support might nevertheless succeed to their full developmental potential. Most would not. So we know they're going to fail at school. We know they're not going to do very well at work. And they are going to fill our juvenile and adult criminal justice systems. And then you notice that the marking is not simply random, but by race and gender. While we do not mark babies' cribs, we could. We could. Because we know likely outcomes, we can fairly well predict their adult opportunities, and those fall along race, gender, and class lines. So in order to dismantle children's inequalities, as part of what I hope is for all of you, a larger project to contribute to equality, we have to focus on who's at the bottom. And black boys are part of the group that's at the bottom. So my argument today is that by focusing on black boys, we can see a path to equality for all. So first and primarily today, I'm going to talk about black boys, about their life course from birth to age 18, because they are my case for children's inequalities. They are not the only children marked at birth, nor am I claiming that they should be our first and our only priority. Rather, that their life course exposes very powerfully how we rig the developmental environment, ending predictably in various forms of subordination by adulthood. And where I think this should lead by examining these patterns is the second part of my talk, which is to a mechanism, a model, a perspective that I hope will begin to address these inequalities, what I call developmental equality. That is, using a developmental framework as a means to attack children's inequalities, to meld the inroads of development, which is a perspective already present in family law, and I mean family law broadly construed. That is, I include all aspects of law that affect families. So to use the developmental perspective that is already there, but in a more meaningful way. It should keep the lens on structural inequality, and it should be explicit about paying attention to identities that matter to inequality. So, to children's race and gender, and to any other identity characteristic that puts them at the bottom of the ladder. So I want to begin with some images, because I hope that you will keep particular individuals in mind. I want to invite you to think about a particular person as yours to think about as I talk. Your brother, your son, your partner, your son-in-law, your nephew, your friend. I want you to think about them as they move through this life course. So with these images, you now may be seeing some that you recognize as I get into the teenage pictures. This is Tamir Rice at age 12, Lionel Tate at age 13, Trayvon Martin at 17, Lacan McDonald at 17, and these are two young men who made it to their early 20s, and they were part of the protests at Mizzou in the fall. If you're wondering what the words on the back of their shirts say, 1839 was built on my black, like that, because Mizzou was physically constructed with slave labor. So, The American dream is one of equality and opportunity, the ability to succeed and to be an individual who can be whatever they want to be, limited only by your own drive and talent. But for black boys, this is not the reality. And I think this quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates really captures this. This is from his book, Between the World and Me, his letter to his then 17-year-old son, expressing that the overriding reality in his son's life is not the dream, but it is danger to the body, filling him with fear for his son. Now, Coates grew up in inner city Baltimore, but that fear is just as real for his son, who is growing up amidst relative wealth and privilege. One of the pieces of the book that I remember reading, literally holding my breath, was when Coates talks about in college being stopped by the Prince Edward County Police. He had done nothing, but he was acutely aware that that meant nothing, and anything that happened to him could be justified. So his fear that he held in that moment, and his fear for his son, is not misplaced. Remember, his letter was triggered by his son's reaction to the failure to indict the Ferguson police officer who killed Michael Brown. And Michael Brown, of course, was neither the first nor the last young black man or boy to lose his life to private or state violence. The frequency with which this happens reinforces the notion that this is unexceptional. So the fear for the body, for life itself, is real for every black boy and man. But I would argue this is just the tip of the iceberg. Beyond the danger to the body is the reality that as children or adults, if they survive, most black boys and men will fall far short of realizing the dream, fall far short of their developmental potential. And that setup begins at birth. So the list of risks likely to be encountered by black boys is a list of state-created, state-reinforced, and state-recognized risks. And the systems that create risk interact. So the predictable outcomes of these interactions are the juvenile and adult criminal justice system. So much so that one scholar has written, African American men figure so prominently in the correctional system that the number of African American 4-year-old males can be used to model the number of people who will be incarcerated. So if you're in the business of building prison cells, you look at the number of 4-year-old black boys. 3 structural factors are in play here, in particular. The state's creation of response to and perpetuation of poverty, what I call the poverty system, the public educational system, and the juvenile justice system. All 3 particularly function to create developmental risk and hurdles for black boys. And those structural factors are permeated by and generated by race and racism, as well as harsh gender consequences. The evidence of that, I think, is apparent in 3 pieces of data, which if you remember nothing else that I say today, I hope you'll pay attention to these. So remember that baby that I showed you first, that baby that is born today, here, whoever you're thinking about. Likelihood that child will be born in poverty is over 1 in 3. Likelihood that that child will graduate from high school, 1 in 2. Likelihood that that child will be incarcerated in his lifetime, 1 in 3. And if he is from the lowest socioeconomic circumstances, that rate of incarceration, 1 in 3, doubles. Goes up by double this amount. So what's going on? What's going on here? So what I've been doing is gathering all of the interdisciplinary studies and work and data that I can find out about the life course of black boys. And let me tell you what I see as the life course patterns, so that you see this interaction between, again, this course of development that is littered with barriers and challenges, that is a setup, a funneling towards failure, not towards a support of opportunity. So first, racialized patterns of development, by that I mean differentiated by race, emerge very early, literally at birth and in early childhood, and they are traceable to some very clear factors. The impact of poverty, the lack of support of black families and communities, the impact of early racial awareness, and the poor quality of our child care and pre-kindergarten or early childhood education. All that's happening before 3. So this child is arriving at the kindergarten door already with multiple developmental challenges. Secondly, you might think, well, you're going to get to school and school's going to make things better. We're going to equalize things out. We're going to address this at school. No. School makes things worse. And particularly, it becomes a gender pattern in addition to the racialized pattern that is so evident in the early childhood years. Remember, everything that's going on in early childhood is still continuing. But now, in addition, as black boys are engaging in the world outside their families and communities, they face stark stereotypes, stark cognitive bias at school, which has an impact on achievement, on inclusion or exclusion, on discipline. All kinds of things are going on disproportionately to black boys, beginning in kindergarten. So, a state-created system, school, is creating those outcomes. Third, in adolescence, as critical a period of development as birth to 3, or arguably birth to 5 is adolescence. All adolescents experience a confusing and challenging array of physical, emotional, cognitive, and other challenges at this stage, as they move from dependency to their own sense of identity as adults. For black boys, to that volatile mix is added the necessity of constructing a racial identity. And that very identity is both a strength, a source of resilience, and a danger. That very identity, simply by walking around, by being who they are, puts them at risk. Particularly, it puts them at risk with respect to police, and then in the juvenile justice system, where they are disproportionately represented at every stage of that system. So this identity, though, again, I said, was a strength. So the last piece that's very interesting from this entire picture, because we tend to hear so much about the negatives, is we have ignored the positive. So who are the black boys, the black youth, the black young men who succeed? Overwhelmingly, they are those who have a strong sense of racial identity, have benefited from the strength of the racial socialization that they received from their families. So there's this dualism in the developmental pattern. You see the effects of subordination as well as positive resistance and success. So we have to be really careful, right? The tendency when you look at the possible tendency in looking at this data is that it's a deterministic mark of failure, inadequacy, inferiority. It is far too easy to look at this data and begin blaming black families, black communities, and fall into a familiar pattern of assuming a script of racial inferiority. On the other hand, if you find some threads of positive success here, if a black boy or black man succeeds, it's easy to shrug off the structural factors that we tend to not want to take a look at. So what I think you pull out of this pattern of dualism is that it is essential to remove the obstacles to developmental success and adult opportunity, to provide equal support for that developmental opportunity, but recognize and sustain the unique and positive cultural strategies that have worked so well. So let me say a little bit more about each of these four pieces. So in terms of, again, that early piece, birth to age 3, you can stop right there, or if you want to extend it a little bit farther, birth to 5, is a time period of critical development and where children's families are the most important piece in that developmental stage. And you could argue even before birth, because the impact of the maternal environment before children are born has an impact on their development as well. But from birth to 3, there's an explosion going on in your brain, literally. And positive support or intervention then has an immense impact on future developmental possibilities. So trauma, or either lack of resources or trauma or stress, also has a strong effect at this stage. So what's the source of chronic stress for black boys? It particularly emanates from poverty and from racism. So those two sources generate stress, and stress challenges children's development in a very significant way. So poverty affects family well-being, family formation, parent-child bonds. It has consequences for physical, intellectual, and emotional development. It affects where kids live, how they live, what they eat, how their family is doing, how their community is doing, how safe they are. So it has an extraordinarily powerful impact. So policies that undermine poor families, that fail to provide opportunity for them or their children, are a public policy choice, structurally enforced, that consigns children to the likelihood of failure if we do nothing about it. And again, I want to stress, this begins in infancy, because at birth, children are, relatively speaking, cognitively equal. When do the differences start emerging? The neuroscience folks would tell us now, at 18 months, differences start emerging that are related to family resources, community resources. By age 3, those differences, those achievement differences are very clearly evident. Again, very clearly documented. So imagine where we are by age 5, right? There's quite a gap can be there just from the difference in available resources. I'm not talking about adverse stresses. The ACEs research, which some of you may be familiar with, adverse childhood experiences, which shows how early adverse experiences can have such a significant impact for lifelong development that you're still feeling in your 50s, 60s, 70s. So, what kinds of programs and policies are particularly important? Child care, and pre-kindergarten. Quality of childcare in the United States uniformly is pretty low. And the high quality childcare is least likely to be available for those with the least resources. For those who need it more, get less. Same with early childhood education. And remember, by age 3, already a significant gap. By age 5, even more so. Do we have examples of programs that work well, that close that gap? Absolutely. This is not pie in the sky. This is, we don't have the data, or we don't know what the systems are. We just have not, we have chosen not to implement them. The other factor I think that we too often ignore is what racism means, not just on a structural level, but on a daily, constant level for a very young child. At what age does a child have racial awareness? 3. By age 3, they are aware of discrimination, they are aware of stereotypes. And that is the foundation for their racial awareness as they begin school. So, what is the perception of discrimination affect? Identity formation, peer relations, academic achievement, occupational goals, mental and physical well-being. This impacts all children, with messages of subordination, privilege, or a combination of both. So both race and poverty generate major developmental challenges, and even for children raised in middle and upper income families, race generates developmental issues. So again, state policies that create and perpetuate structural causes of poverty, that fail to provide resources to families and communities, that fail to provide resources to provide critical developmental support to their children, and that fail to address the ongoing cultural and structural presence of discrimination, all are having an impact on development at this very early stage. I'm still talking about no greater age than 3 or 5. And again, you might think, well, won't school make this better? Well, it doesn't. School not only doesn't make it better, it makes it worse. Okay? So, now, in addition to those early developmental hurdles, Black boys are subject to significant stereotyping and cognitive bias from teachers, other school personnel, as they begin school. So what are the consequences of this? Differential and declining school achievement, disproportionate diagnosis for learning disabilities, and then exclusion from mainstream classrooms, and disproportionate discipline that they mean they're excluded from school entirely by suspension or expulsion. Very high disproportionate rates there. And remember, we still have a very highly functioning school-to-prison pipeline. So school discipline doesn't just get you down to the vice principal's office, which was back in the day what would happen in high school. It's going to, the school resource officer is going to pick you up and you will be taken down and put in the juvenile detention center. You'll go into the juvenile justice system because of what is going on at school. So, again, what's happening? The evidence suggests strong stereotypes, strong cognitive bias, and that cognitive bias is both a negative against Black boys, but also increasing evidence is showing is favoritism for white kids. So there's bias that is in the favoritism direction and in the negative bias direction. One of the strongest stereotypes about Black men is that they are dangerous, that they're criminals, that they are associated with evil and threat. And again, this is probably not something that you're unaware of because you, like me, have been seeing the increasing video evidence of how that plays out in some of the police encounters that we have been seeing now that no one's describing, but that we can all see. When does the rate of discipline really spike in terms of a race and gender differential? 3rd grade. So remember that person you're keeping in your head? What are they looking like as a 3rd grader? It's no longer that toddler or young child. That is about the age at which kids start physically emerging into the bodies they're going to have as teenagers and then adults. And that's when this particularly seems to trigger. So remember, stereotypes have an effect on the people who are interacting with black boys, but they also have an effect on the children themselves. Again, some of you may be familiar with the work of Claude Steele on stereotype threat, that and how then this affects achievement. Lost my slide. And last but not least, racism has an impact on mental health because it is an everyday, a constant, a chronic piece. It's deep, chronic, and potentially debilitating, and resistance to it requires the marshaling of powerful resources. This kind of resilience is far more difficult to muster by children. And remember, they're needing to muster it from age 3. So, again, coming back to adolescence, to that piece of this arc of development. The core task of adolescence is the development of identity and separation from one's parents. And for all boys, what comes powerfully into play in terms of creating identity at adolescence is the influence of masculinities, which carries the risk of hypermasculinity, hiding hypervulnerability. So what we often see as an expression of hypermasculinity, in fact, is a covering of hypervulnerability. But again, for black boys, this is even more volatile because they are most at risk for being perceived as dangerous. They are highly policed, and so any identity that they adopt, which is an important resilience factor, has this danger factor as well. It brings them disproportionately in contact with the juvenile justice system, with police, whether it's in school or now, by adolescents, increasingly it's also on the streets. So to give you an example of what that disproportionality looks like, I pulled up some data from New York, because I figured you might want to know what this is like locally. So this is from a report by the Vera Institute. It shows in the juvenile justice system absolutely staggering rate of disproportionality on the basis of color. Remember, the juvenile justice system might as well still be called the boys' justice system because it is 80% populated by boys, 20% by girls. So, according to this report about the low, and I picked New York City rather than Long Island because I could get data for that. Let's take arrest figures. The arrest rate for blacks is for black youth, this is under 18, is 8 times higher than it is for white youth of the same age. 8 times. And by the time we get to arraignment, of those arraigned, and not all cases obviously go to arraignment, 94% are minorities. And of those, 65% of those are African American. 29% are Latinos. So that's that adolescent risk factor personified in that system. Oh, and remember my other figures were on high school graduation and poverty rate. So the poverty rate, the black poverty rate in New York City is roughly 1 in 4. All right. High school graduation rate, I don't know if you know, maybe you guys all know this. The high school graduation rate for black and Latino boys is the lowest in the country. right? I gave you 1 and 2. The rate this is for the state, but this is driven dominantly by New York City numbers, is 37%. 37%. What's the rate for white boys? 78%. Pretty dramatic difference. So again, I'm saying all those pieces are interconnected, and it creates a compounding of systems that create developmental risk and subordination for black boys. So, but again, I want to remind you that in terms of racial identity, a good bit of this is resistance, sometimes read as oppositional, sort of you are, that black youth are doing themselves in by making bad choices, by not wanting to succeed. But I think the data, again, and the researchers would tend to suggest to us that what we are really looking at is resistance to an oppressive system, is resistance to adopting, it is, again, the challenge of identity that is a very racialized and genderized challenge. The other evidence of how strongly positive racial identity is that some social scientists who had looked at level of self-esteem, you might think, oh, level of self-esteem is going to be low for children of color. It's actually high, and the group that has the highest rate of self-esteem is African American boys and young men. So again, I think that's attributable to the strength of what they get from their families. So, given all of this, and I probably already talked too long, but I hope it's okay to continue. So, what do I take out of these patterns that I've told you about? What does it tell you about development? What should it tell us about using a developmental perspective in law and using development as a possible legal tool to argue for that children who are vulnerable, by definition are vulnerable and deserve our support, deserve equal support to equally achieve their developmental opportunity. So this is grounded in a combination of identities theory as well as vulnerabilities theory. Okay, here's how we usually think about development. Don't worry, I'm not going to make you look at the fine print here. But we think of it in a linear fashion, right? When does the baby crawl, stand up, talk, all that kind of thing. And by the way, a good part of this line that you're seeing is 0 to 3, 0 to 5. The other major color up there is a representation of adolescence. So those are the two really key developmental periods. Great, important for us to remember, right? We also sometimes incorporate in law a more contextual ecological model that comes from the work of Yuri Bronfenbrenner and also from the introduction of that work, particularly by the work of Barbara Bennett Woodhouse, a former colleague of mine. Now, look who's at the middle here. Individual child. No race, no gender, no class. And if we go back to the linear model, we're just looking at the child. Right? But I've just told you a whole litany of data that says identity matters. So what I'm suggesting is that in law, if we use a neutral model of development as a factor to try and change legal rules, all we do is reinforce privilege. That we have to use a developmental model that puts identity, particularly race and gender, right at the center, right at the core. So, how to do that? I'm going to skip over talking about the social scientists that I think are incredibly helpful to tell us how to put race and gender into our developmental perspective, how it would help us to look at and trigger an examination of structural factors that are not providing support but are creating barriers. And that's Margaret Beale Spencer and Cynthia Garcia Cole. absolutely fantastic and powerful work. We need to meld that perspective, I think, to a robust and substantive notion of equality and what equality means, what real equality means. And I keep coming back to this quotation from Palmer against Sidney, a family law case, of course, and think, yes, we haven't come close to this yet. We have not done away with all governmentally imposed discrimination based on race. And I hope I've convinced you by the data I've presented to you that if we can see that in the lives of black boys, they are not the only ones. If we know that children are unequal in their opportunities, then we have not done away with this discrimination. So, using that race and gender informed perspective in a broad array of family law, this is what I hope it could do. I hope it could dismantle, get the barriers out of the way. That it would also mandate and require affirmative support. Yes, I am talking about positive constitutional rights. I know that's your dean said to me, good luck changing the world. Well, okay, I think we should all keep that goal in mind. It would mean positive constitutional rights, and I think the best group we could make that case for is children, because they do rely on us in order to become adults. If we need to have some more rational reason for doing this as opposed to a moral or humanitarian one, there's good economic reasons for doing this, right? We will be fostering our economic capital. We will be making for not just a more just society, but a more productive one. So, I'm hoping that when we look in the window at the babies, that we won't be able to know what their future might be by identifying them by race and or gender. Thank you very much. Comments?
I'll go ahead.
Students first, that's how we do everything here.
I have a question. So one of the things you stated at the end was changing the macro system and building human capital. I guess just with this instance, it's easy to talk about things on the general macro level, but if you could give like a specific instance of how we're about to be lawyer students, a lot of us are graduating, so how we could
Well, the macro system includes law, right? But it also includes how we talk about things, how we challenge them, how we understand them. Right? So I'll give you an example. The report on the Chicago Police Department came out yesterday, right? And you know, oh, isn't this terrible? The Chicago Police Department is infected with racism. As if that's just one little bad apple out there. So connecting those pieces together, how you talk about them, how anybody talks about them, to say, you know, the police, in my view, are a reflection of us. They aren't something different from us. We can't blame this all on them. They are a reflection of us, right? So how you talk about this, how you think about it, how you discuss it with other young lawyers, with people who will ask your opinion because you're a lawyer and because you're a woman of color, right? What you say, right, is going to carry weight. So I think part of this is how you understand and discuss and articulate, right? I think more concretely, if you're one of those people representing a young man who is going into the juvenile justice, hopefully not, but who's been arrested, you have that data, that information to try and persuade again, that to ensure to the best of your ability that his identity does not put him deep in that system. So one of the pieces of data I didn't give you, so the likelihood that he will be diverted into something that's not going to end up as a mark on his record is half as good as the white kid standing next to him. So make it as good as the white kid standing next to him. Get him to the diversion program or talk, so those are some concrete things, I think. And if there's anybody that you can help who needs that extra assistance, all of us can help at least one person. Whether we're tutoring them, whether we're providing them with other kinds of support. And that support through a system is stacked against you, but at least it can help one person to foster their resilience. But keep working for system change is what I would say is key.
What's the most effective community outreach or diversion program that you've seen in practice that makes a difference?
At the juvenile justice level or before?
Any level.
Okay, well, let me give you one that I think is again, I've become convinced in the course of doing this work that 0 to 3, 0 to 5 is a totally unaddressed opportunity, right? So one of the most effective is called the Nurse Family Partnership Program. It gets, so it's going into support young families, particularly with their first child. What if you knew going into this, right? Okay, if I don't do anything, my child is already going to be at a disadvantage going to school. Okay, well, what can I do? So whether it's health care, whether it's reading to your child, whatever those pieces are, they go into the families, not to intervene, hassle, interrogate, give them a hard time, right? But to provide resources. This is what you can do so that you make sure that your kid isn't part of that gap at age 3. And so that's one example. There's lots of them. There's lots of programs out there that, again, if there is advocacy to spend the money to do that, because you're not going to feel good about your child doing well just because you happen to be in an advantaged position. You take all children as your children, and you'll be an advocate for those programs. So the more that could be done from 0 to 3, the better. Absolutely the better. A second one, okay, is, does anybody in this room know about ACEs? If you don't, find out about ACEs. Adverse childhood experiences. Be informed. Be informed. And I'm going to tell you that probably everybody in this room, if you do the ACE questionnaire, you will find that you have an ACE, that I have 1 or 2. It's extraordinary. It's not those people have ACEs, but you don't. We all have them. So it's a good self-knowledge tool, but also it may help you understand why your clients are behaving the way they are. It might be due to an ACEs factor. It's a critical piece for anybody who wants to practice criminal law, family law, in my opinion. Okay, so that's another concrete thing that you can do. If you want to know where to find it, it's on the CDC website, but if you just Google ACE, it'll come up. It's really a powerful advocacy tool, because you also could use it for that kid you're representing, saying, you know, Your Honor, this kid has 6 ACEs and he's only 12, and no one has intervened to help him. Let's give him some intervention, some diversion, rather than putting him somewhere where it's going to make that. Yeah.
So last week we had Paul Butler speak here, and his idea is that good people shouldn't be prosecutors. Do you think that that belief is part of the problem that you're talking about? That if good people don't become prosecutors, this will continue?
I think good people need to do all different manner of things. Yes, good people need to be prosecutors, public defenders. They need to be doing pro bono work. There's plenty to go around. What I thought you were going to say is Paul Butler also was at UF this year, He was talking about the difference between ratchets and transformation. I don't know if you, but that's the idea. You know, ratchet is a tool that you use this and it moves things a little bit. Transformation would be, you know, that's like the Supreme Court same-sex marriage opinion. That was transformation. A ratchet is, you at least hope you're moving forward, not moving back. So sometimes you're looking for something that's at least, you know, I mean, for me, if I can help move the dial half an inch, I will feel like I succeeded. If I've persuaded any of you, and I know you're all going to be phenomenal lawyers, then I feel like I've really succeeded today. If I haven't persuaded you, then don't talk to me anymore. Work on persuading you with some more information. Did that answer your question? Yes, sir.
Yeah, Professor, I've got two comments. One of them is I was very impressed by what you said at the beginning. That is, you have to look at the bottom. And this triggered something that I read many years ago, in Landon Years' book, The Minus Cannery.
Yes.
And then the second point regarding marshalling resources in African American males and females in the face of racism. And that popped in my mind was what Steele spoke about in Grossman
Yes.
what do you call it, the microaggressions and the effect that has on the school performance.
Yes.
So again, that's the whole compounding thing. But the last thing I wanted to ask you, Professor, was what are your thoughts on Dr. Gay's theory on post-traumatic stress disorder with regards to the African American family, and you having spoken about the linear perspective that we have, and then theory of one-family ecological model.
Yes.
How about this stuff that happened 3, 4, 5, 600 years ago, you know? And I do remember a clip in one of her videos. She was like, you see your mother acting like, just snapping on something, you know? And she's like, that stuff comes from that extra vigilance. That comes from years and years of trying to adapt to an environment. What are your thoughts?
So my thoughts on that are, and thank you for compliment and also for the links to those wonderful scholars that you mentioned. I do think it's tricky, right? The answer to your question is that's kind of tricky because on the one hand, do I think that there is an intergenerational effect from what is only barely one generation back of Jim Crow, right? Where you know, so again, when you, and the range in this room in age is probably somewhere mid-20s to, I'm not going to, right? But when you, I want you to just think about, even for the 20-somethings, right? Your parents maybe were living through the first time that desegregation was even tried, right? Now you go back to your grandparents, were at Jim Crow. Go back to your great-grandparents. You know, this isn't far back. This isn't far back. So what would be the consequences of not just for a family, but an entire community to be treated this way? Now, what do I think is the worry that I have as I say that? Oh, that's why they're damaged, they're broken, they're not, no. That's not what I mean. That's not what I mean. So I think on the one hand, we have to have recognition of that. And of thinking through not just psychically what that means, but economically what that means. That's why I say it's a poverty system. This isn't a lack of individual effort. This is intergenerational poverty that has been fostered by the state. And we still see it, right? We still see it. Our rate of housing segregation is higher now than it was 20 years ago. Our rate of school segregation is higher now, right? And why is that happening? Public policy. We make choices. Right? So I'm glad you bring that point up because, again, one of the things that's been really interesting in looking at sort of the psychological literature, and even at the child development literature. So the child development norms, okay, at this age, you should be doing X. You should be, I'm not talking about physical, what you're doing or not doing, but say emotionally, psychologically, you should be this level of mature. And so acting normally is X. Who's been studied to create those norms? White kids. That's where the norms come from. As one researcher put it, even the rat was white. So our norms of when they're deciding if a kid is misbehaving in school track to a developmental norm is a norm that is racially infused. It's not only white kids who have been studied, but primarily middle-class white kids. So even the scientific norms themselves have been constructed in a racialized way. So there's that piece in there. And in terms of psychology, in terms of the people who are doing therapy and creating models of, who has, again, the black psychologists have for probably 40 years now been saying the psychological models of health, again, are based on the life course of life experience of white folks. So the actual understanding of the impact of race, even apart from historical issues, is actually pretty minimal. And so there's this skew in the social science data that reflects who's been doing research and what they're interested in. And what have they been interested in primarily when it comes to black kids? Why are they screwing up? What's wrong with them? And you can hear that, back what I was talking about with you, it's like, oh, there's something wrong with that kid, something wrong with families. Oh, okay, it's single-parent families, that must be it. So we're looking for blame. So a lot of the data is in there. Long answer to the question.
All right, I think we need to stop the formal Q&A because I know a lot of people have questions, but also people have to go places. So I invite anyone who wants to talk to Nancy. I'm sure she would be more than happy to do that.